The morning of
We have to
November
move now.
14th
Not
arrived
without
over
a
the
plan and
Mojave
suicide.
Desert, the way
He's
bad
right.
news
Wait.
always
We
does
can't.
quietly
My
without
call.
warning, and with a
All
cold
right,
that
boys,
settled
let's
into your
ride.
bones before you
You
even
got
had
it,
time to
boss.
brace
Let's
for it.
move out.
The town of Barstow,
I
California
won't
had
do
never
it.
been a place
You
people
have no
chose.
choice.
It was a place people ended
Watch me
up.
leave.
A crossroads town, the kind of place that existed not because anyone had dreamed it into being, but because the highway needed a punctuation mark somewhere between Los Angeles and nowhere. The gas stations outnumbered the churches. The motels outnumbered the gas stations. And on a morning like this one, when the desert wind came off the flats with a bite that reminded old men of winters they had survived in worse places, the only warm light for 3 blocks in any direction came from the neon sign above the Copperhead Diner. The sign buzzed and flickered. The letter C in Copperhead, gone dark sometime in October, and never replaced so that it read Opperhead Diner to anyone approaching from the west. Nobody complained. In Barstow, you were grateful for what still worked. Inside, the air was thick and close, scorched coffee bacon grease, the faint, sweet rot of the pie case that had seen better decades. The linoleum floor was the color of old mustard worn pale near the counter stools, where 1,000 elbows had rested over 1,000 mornings just like this one. Patsy Cline drifted out of a speaker above the register, sad and certain as weather. At a corner booth near the back, half hidden by the shadow thrown by a dying neon sign advertising Coca-Cola in cursive, sat Loretta Voss. Most people who knew her called her Retta. The few who had known her for 50 years or more, the kind of knowing that comes from shared grief and shared silence, called her that, with a particular tenderness, the way you say the name of someone you are relieved is still alive. She was 73 years old, and she looked every year of it without apology. Her hair, white as January, was pinned back with the careful precision of a woman who still believed that appearance was a form of dignity, even on mornings when dignity was the hardest thing to hold on to. Her hands folded around a white ceramic coffee mug were the hands of someone who had worked them. Hard-knuckled and spotted and slightly unsteady now, though anyone who had watched her use those hands over the years would have told you they had never once failed her when it mattered. She wore a gray wool sweater, the kind that had been washed so many times it had lost its original shape and become something softer, something that fit the way only old things can fit, like it had learned the architecture of her body and decided to stay. On the left lapel, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a small bronze pin, a Korean War Veterans Association emblem. Not hers by service, hers by marriage, hers by grief. The mug was full. She had not drunk from it. Retta was staring through the plate glass window of the Copperhead Diner at a cinder block building across the 4-lane highway. The building was painted the color of old bone, and above its double doors hung a hand-lettered banner in red, white, and blue that read, VFW Post 4, 04 50th Anniversary Reunion, Welcome Home, Brothers. The clock above the diner's pie case read 11:17. She had 43 minutes. She had been sitting in this booth for 2 hours. The truth about Loretta Voss, the truth that had kept her awake at 3 in the morning for the better part of 15 years, the truth that lived in the back of her throat like something she could neither swallow nor spit out, was this. She was a fraud, not a small fraud, not a white lie, harmless, forgettable fraud. The kind of fraud that had grown so large over so many years that it had become in some terrible way load-bearing. Remove it and something structural collapsed. For 15 years, Retta had told the men who were coming to that VFW hall today, the old soldiers who had served alongside her first husband, Corporal Dale Voss, before Dale was killed at the Battle of Triangle Hill in the autumn of 1952, she had told them that her son Callum was a success story, a triumph. The living proof that the sacrifices made by men like Dale had meant something, had built something, had left something worth leaving. She had told them Callum was a senior architect at a prestigious firm in Seattle. She had described his apartment overlooking Puget Sound, his steady girlfriend, his easy confidence in the world. She had fabricated a Christmas card. She claimed he had sent a phone call where he had made her laugh so hard she had to sit down. She had constructed brick by careful brick over 15 years of Veterans Day lunches and Memorial Day ceremonies, a version of her son that was everything Dale Voss had died hoping his family would become. The devastating, immovable truth was that Retta had not spoken to Callum Voss since a wet Tuesday morning in the spring of 2012. He had called her from a number she didn't recognize. His voice stretched thin and strange, and told her in a voice scraped clean of everything warm that he needed space. That the way she had leaned on him after Gerald died, Gerald, her second husband Callum's father, the quiet, patient man who had raised a child under the shadow of another man's legend and done it without a single word of complaint, the way she had leaned on Callum after Gerald's death in 2005 had taken something from him that he needed back. She had not understood then what he was really telling her. She understood it now. After Gerald died, Retta had fallen apart in the way that strong women sometimes fall apart invisibly medically, one prescription at a time. First the sleeping pills because the nights were impossible, then the anxiety medication because the days were no better. Then the combination of both, chased sometimes with a glass of wine, she told herself didn't count, because it was just wine, and then a second glass, and then the years began to blur at the edges in a way that was both terrible and for a while a relief. Callum had watched his mother disappear into a pharmaceutical fog. He had tried more than once to reach a hand in after her. Each time she had assured him she was fine, she was managing, she just needed a little help to sleep. Each time the lie had cost them both something they would not get back. By 2012, there was nothing left to cost. He left. And Retta, shattered and ashamed, and still half-medicated, built a beautiful lie in his absence because the alternative, sitting in that VFW hall, across from Raymond Price, who had carried Dale's dog tags off the hill at Triangle Hill and wept when he handed them to her, and telling that man that Dale's legacy had produced an addict and a woman who had failed her only child, that alternative was not something she could survive. She had been clean for 8 years. 8 years of early mornings and late cravings and AA meetings in church basements that smelled of industrial coffee and old carpet. Prescott Weiland, commercial real estate developer. Seattle. She knew exactly who Prescott Weiland was. She had not known his connection to Raymond. That was new, and it was devastating, but she knew the name. She had searched it alone in her kitchen at 2 in the morning with a cup of chamomile tea and the specific dread of a woman who had been putting off a reckoning for too long. Prescott Weiland's firm had been involved on the acquisition side in the unraveling of the company that had fired her son. If Prescott Weiland knew the details, and men like Prescott Weiland always knew the details, then the lie Retta had been carrying for 15 years was about to be dismantled in front of the 7 remaining men who had loved Dale Voss. In front of the men she had looked in the eye year after year and told that Dale's sacrifice had meant something. She felt a physical sensation in her chest that she could not have named, not quite pain, not quite fear. Something older than both. The particular weight of a person who has finally run out of road. Retta Voss looked around the diner. She looked at the other patrons, a trucker at the counter, a young mother cutting pancakes for a toddler in a booth near the window, an old man in a John Deere cap reading a newspaper with the concentrated attention of someone with nowhere to be. She looked at Brenda, the waitress who had been working this counter since the first Bush administration, and moved through the diner with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything she saw here. Then the windows rattled. Not the wind, something lower, more deliberate. A vibration that started in the floor and traveled up through the booth seat and into Retta's spine before she had consciously processed what she was hearing. Motorcycles. Not one, not two. 5, at least, by the sound, the deep rolling thunder of large displacement engines running in loose formation, downshifting as they turned off the highway into the diner's gravel lot. The sound built and then cut off all at once, leaving behind a silence that somehow felt louder than the noise had been. Gravel crunched. Heavy boots. Then the door swung open. The brass bell above the door was completely inadequate to the occasion. They came in without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony. 5 men ranging from their mid-50s to their early 60s wearing the heavy denim and scuffed black leather that was less a fashion choice than a second skin. On the back of each vest, the unmistakable patch, the winged death's head, the arched rockers, the name of the club that had been simultaneously mythologized and demonized for 70 years. Hell's Angels, Barstow Chapter. The diner's ambient noise, the low conversation, the clink of silverware, the murmur of the small television above the register did not gradually fade. It stopped the way sound stops when something large moves through water. The trucker at the counter found his newspaper very interesting. The young mother drew her toddler instinctively closer. The old man in the John Deere cap did not look up, which suggested he had been in Barstow long enough to have developed good instincts about when not to look up. Brenda the waitress swallowed once visibly, then picked up a stack of menus and walked toward them with the measured courage of a woman who had learned that hospitality was the best armor. Retta watched from her corner booth. They took the largest table in the center of the room, a round four-top that they rearranged with casual authority, pulling over an extra chair, settling into the space the way men settle into spaces they have decided belong to them. Their conversation resumed among themselves, low and unintelligible from across the room, punctuated by short laughter and the flat thud of a coffee mug being set down too hard. Retta's eyes moved to the man at the head of the group. She had spent enough years around men to read them quickly. It was a skill she had developed not from suspicion, but from necessity. The widow's skill. The skill of a woman who has had to navigate the world alone and learned early that knowing what kind of man you were dealing with was the difference between safety and a situation. This man was not like the others at his table. He was bigger for one thing, not just in height, though he had that easily 6'4", with the wide-shouldered build of someone who had done physical work for 30 years and whose body had been shaped by it the way river water shapes stone. His arms resting on the table were heavy with muscle and covered from wrist to bicep in ink. Some of it old and blurred the blue-gray of decades-old work, some of it newer and more deliberate, the kind of tattoo that tells a story rather than just staking a claim. He had a shaved head and a thick beard, gone mostly gray at the jaw, and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline, the scar of someone who had been hit very hard once a long time ago and had kept going. He was not a young man, 64 perhaps, or close to it, the age that arrives on some men, like a refinement burning away everything that isn't essential and leaving behind something dense and weather-tested in entirely itself. His eyes from across the diner were the particular pale blue of a desert sky in January, cold and clear and utterly exhaustingly awake. The patch on the front of his vest read Ironside. Below it, the three-piece patch of the club's hierarchy confirmed what his posture already communicated. This was the man the others oriented toward, the gravity in the room, Hank Ironside Decker. Retta had no way of knowing his name. She only knew what she saw, and what she saw through the eyes of a woman who had spent 50 years learning to look past the obvious surface of things to the thing underneath. Was this a man carrying a weight he had learned to make invisible? Not the performance of strength. The real thing, the exhausted, load-bearing strength of someone who had been the person others leaned on for so long that the leaning had become structural, and he no longer remembered what it had felt like to stand completely upright. She recognized it because she had seen it in the mirror every morning for 40 years. She looked at the clock. 11:31, 29 minutes. Retta looked across the highway at the VFW banner. She looked at her phone. She looked at the cold coffee in the mug. She looked at the small bronze Korean War pin on her lapel, Dale's pin worn smooth at the edges from decades of handling. And then Loretta Voss did something that she would later be unable to fully explain even to herself. Not because it didn't make sense, but because the sense it on was the deep, wordless kind that bypasses the reasoning mind entirely and operates out of something older and more desperate. She slid out of the booth, her knees protested. 73 years of protest from knees that had stood at hospital bedsides, knelt at gravesides, climbed the front porch steps of a Barstow house, alone in the dark for too many nights to count. She steadied herself with one hand on the table edge, straightened her sweater, and picked up the small purse beside her. From the purse, she removed her wallet. From the wallet, she removed the only large bill she kept there, a $100 bill that she had been carrying for 6 weeks since the invitation to the VFW reunion had arrived in a cream envelope with Raymond Price's careful handwriting on the front. She had looked at that bill at least a dozen times in 6 weeks trying to understand what she was thinking. Now she understood. She crossed the diner's black and white checkered floor. The distance from her corner booth to the round table at the center of the room was perhaps 30 feet. It felt longer. She was aware with the peripheral sensitivity of someone who has spent their life reading rooms, that every pair of eyes in the diner was tracking her, some openly, some sideways, and that the noise level, which had partially recovered since the biker's arrival, dropped again as she approached. The man with the scorpion tattoo on his neck. Cole, though Retta didn't know that yet, registered her approach first. He shifted his weight forward in his chair, not quite standing, not quite blocking her, but establishing a presence, a wall of casual threat. "You need something, ma'am." It was almost polite. Almost. Retta did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Ironside, who was stirring a black coffee with a small plastic spoon and had not yet looked up, though she was certain he was aware of her. Men like that were always aware of Bond. "I need to speak to him," she said. Her voice did not shake. Cole glanced at Ironside. Ironside continued stirring for exactly 2 more rotations of the spoon, then set it down and lifted his eyes. He looked at her the way she imagined a man looks at a situation he hasn't anticipated but intends to understand. Deliberate, unhurried. His gaze moved to the pin on her lapel, the Korean War Veterans Association emblem, held there for a moment, then came back to her face. "Let her speak," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected, a low resonance that seemed to come from the floor of his chest rather than his throat. He gestured to the empty chair at the end of the table. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand," Retta said. "This won't take long, and I want to be able to leave with my dignity if you say no." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, something more careful than that. "All right," he said. The table was quiet. Retta placed the $100 bill on the table in front of him. She did it without drama, without apology, the way she had learned to do hard things directly and before she could talk herself out of them. "My name is Loretta Voss," she said. "In 25 minutes, I'm supposed to walk across that highway to the VFW Hall for the 50th reunion of my late husband's platoon. My husband was Corporal Dale Voss. He was killed in Korea in 1952, and the men in that hall today are the men he served with. They are old. Several of them are not well. This is likely the last time they will all be in the same room." She paused. Nobody at the table spoke. "For 15 years, she continued, I have told those men that my son Callum is a successful architect in Seattle, that he is well, that he is the living proof that Dale's sacrifice built something worth building." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this speech in the parking lot of this diner for 10 minutes before coming inside, and she delivered it now the way she had rehearsed it, cleanly, without self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she had decided she could not afford today. "The truth is that I haven't spoken to my son in 13 years. He went through things I won't describe to a stranger. He is not in Seattle. He is not an architect. And today, a man named Prescott Weiland, Raymond Price's nephew who works in commercial real estate in Seattle, is going to walk into that VFW hall and almost certainly know enough to dismantle every word of what I've said." The diner was so quiet that Retta could hear the grease popping on the flat-top grill behind the pass-through window. "You're about my son's age," she said. "You have his coloring. If you were willing to come across that highway with me and sit beside me for 2 hours as my son, I would not ask you for another thing in your life." She looked down at the $100 bill on the table. "I know what this is worth, and I know what I'm asking is worth more. I'm not trying to insult you. It's everything I have in my wallet." One of the other men at the table, a heavy-set one with a gray beard and the amused expression of someone watching a circus, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lady, you have lost your mind. You want Ironside to walk into a room full of war veterans and play your son?" Retta understood exactly what she was asking. She reached out to retrieve the $100 bill. She had made her speech, and she would accept the answer, and she would walk out of the Copperhead Diner and across the highway and sit beside Raymond Price and absorb whatever came, because there was in the end no alternative. Ironside's hand came down over hers, not hard, not threatening, with a precision that suggested he had made a deliberate choice about how much force to use and had chosen almost none. His hand was enormous and heavily calloused and warm, and it covered hers and the bill completely. She stopped. He held her hand there for 3 full seconds. Then he released it and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and looked at the Korean war pin on her lapel for a long moment. "My father served in Korea," he said. The table went very still. His voice had changed registers, still deep but quieter now, stripped of the performative authority. "He came back in 1952. He had a way of sitting in rooms that my mother used to describe as being present in body only. Like he had left something over there and spent the rest of his life trying to get comfortable without it. He was not a violent man." He paused. "He was not a gentle man either. He was somewhere in between the kind of man the war made, not the kind he had intended to be. He unfolded his arms and looked at his hands on the table. He died in 1987 in a VA hospital in Riverside. Alone. I was 27 years old and I was in county lockup on a weapons charge, and by the time they told me, he had already been in the ground for 3 days. He paused again. I never got to say what I should have said when I had the chance, and he never had the guts to ask on what he should have asked for. He looked up at Retta. Put your money away, he said. Retta stared at him. I said, put it away. He turned to Cole. Get my food boxed up. Cole opened his mouth. Ironside's eyes moved to him with a quality of attention that closed the conversation before it started. Box it up. Ironside stood. He was taller than he had seemed sitting down, which was saying something. Retta had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, which she did, because she had not come this far to look at the floor. He reached up and unzipped his leather vest, the one with the Death's Head patch and the Hells Angels rockers, and shrugged it off his shoulders with the deliberateness of a man removing something significant. He handed it to Cole without looking at him. Can't go into a VFW wearing colors, he said simply. Underneath the vest, he wore a plain black long-sleeve shirt that fit close across the width of his chest. No club insignia, just a man in a black shirt. It's disrespectful to the service. He looked at Retta. We need a story, he said. Walk me through what you've told them. I need every detail. And that was when, for the first time in 2 hours, Loretta Voss felt the iron clamp around her lungs release very slightly enough to breathe. They stood near the diner's front window, speaking in low voices, while Cole organized the food, and the other men watched with expressions ranging from bewilderment to the careful neutrality of people who had learned not to question certain decisions. Retta spoke quickly and precisely the story she had built over 15 years, compressed now into its essential elements, the way a building blueprint reduces a structure to its skeleton. Senior architect. Seattle. Successful. The version of Callum that Dale Voss's sacrifice was supposed to have made possible. Ironside listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I build custom motorcycles, he said. Own a shop in San Bernardino, Iron and Bone Custom Cycles. Been running it for 11 years. That's what I actually know. That's what I can talk about without stumbling. Retta looked at him. Callum doesn't build motorcycles. Callum, the version of Callum we're about to walk in there with, left the architecture firm 5 years ago, Ironside said. Sitting behind a desk was killing him. He missed working with his hands. He opened a custom fabrication shop in San Bernardino. It's close enough to the truth that I won't contradict myself into a room full of men in their 70s leaving a corporate job to do manual work is not a scandal. It's common sense. Retta considered this. It was, she realized, a better story than the one she had built. Cleaner, more believable. And she would understand only later that the reason it was better was because Ironside was not inventing it. He was simply telling the truth and changing the name. My name, he said. Callum Voss. She spelled the first name without being asked. Callum, he said at once, trying it on. All right. Cole appeared with a to-go box and set it on the table without comment. The other men watched their president prepare to walk across a desert highway into a room full of elderly veterans for a reason that defied any explanation any of them would have predicted this morning. Ironside picked up his to-go box and handed it to Cole. Then he looked at Retta. Ready. She straightened her sweater. She touched the Korean war pin on her lapel habit the same way other people touch a cross or a rabbit's foot. The small, worn ritual of reaching for something you can no longer hold. One moment, she said. She opened her purse and found her wallet and slid the $100 bill back inside. Then she found what she was looking for, a small photograph, wallet-sized, creased soft at the edges from years of handling. She looked at it for a moment. A lake somewhere in Northern California, 1994. Gerald Voss at the bow of a rented rowboat laughing at something off camera. Beside him, a 7-year-old Callum with ice cream on his nose, squinting into the sun, laughing the same laugh. She was about to put it back in the wallet when Ironside moved toward the door and his jacket brushed against her arm and the wallet slipped. It hit the linoleum and fell open. Ironside bent to retrieve it fast for a man his size, automatic, the reflex of someone who had learned to recover things quickly. He handed it back to her, but as he did, something fell from his own jacket pocket. A battered leather wallet, old and soft with use, and from it, a single photograph, small and creased, fluttered to the floor. It landed face up. Retta looked at it before she could stop herself. Two young men standing in front of a garage bay laughing. One of them, she could see, even in the small format, had a jagged scar along his jawline. The other man's face was turned slightly away from the camera. The photo was old, 5 years, maybe 6, the colors beginning to warm toward yellow at the edges. Something tightened in Retta's chest that she did not understand. It was the laughing man with the scar. Something about the line of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, the open quality of the laugh. The laugh of a man who had climbed back from somewhere dark and was still surprised every time to find light on the other side. It reminded her of Gerald. Not in the obvious way, not the face, not the build. Something underneath the surface. The look of a man who had nearly drowned and was standing in the sun, astonished to be dry. Ironside picked up the photograph quickly, too quickly, the practiced recovery of someone who keeps things they don't want noticed, and tucked it back into the wallet and the wallet back into his pocket. His eyes met hers. She did not ask. He did not explain. "Let's go," he said. They walked out of the Copperhead diner into the brittle November air. The Hells Angels were trailing out behind them, taking up positions beside their bikes with the easy proprietary calm of men accustomed to waiting in parking lots. Cole held Ironside's leather vest folded over his arm. Nobody spoke. The desert wind came off the flats and found every gap in Retta's wool sweater, and she pulled it tighter around herself without breaking stride. Beside her, Hank Decker, 6'4", 250 pounds of ink and scar tissue, and 64 years of a story she didn't know, walked with his hands loose at his sides and matched her pace without being asked. They crossed the 4-lane highway. A truck blew past going west, buffeting them both, and Ironside shifted slightly, barely perceptibly, between her and the traffic. She noticed. She said nothing. The VFW hall's double doors were wooden and heavy painted blue that had been fading since the 90s. Above them, the reunion banner rippled in the wind. Through the doors, muffled, she could hear voices, the particular register of old men greeting each other, the volume turned up because half of them were hard of hearing, the warmth unmistakable, even through 2 inches of painted wood. Retta stopped at the doors. Ironside stopped beside her. She was aware suddenly and with a clarity that was almost painful of how absurd this was. She was a 73-year-old woman standing at the door of a VFW hall in the Mojave Desert, about to introduce a Hells Angels president to the men who had served with her dead husband as her living son. The absurdity was not lost on her. Neither was the desperation that had made it feel like the only option. Neither was the fact that the man standing beside her, this stranger who owed her nothing and had agreed to give her something she had no right to ask for, had taken off his identifying insignia out of respect for a group of old soldiers he had never met. A man who understood what respect cost and paid it anyway. Retta touched the Korean war pin on her lapel. "They're going to ask about your hands," she said quietly. "The tattoos." "Let them ask," he said. "Raymond Price, Gundog, he's in a wheelchair, oxygen tank. His handshake is weak, but his eyes are not. He will look at you the way he used to look at replacements when they first arrived in the unit measuring. He knew Dale for 2 years in Korea. He has been honoring his memory for 70 years. Ironside was quiet for a moment. "I'll treat him like he deserves," he said. "That's the only thing I know how to do." Retta looked at him. In his ice-blue eyes, beneath the surface of the man who had walked into a desert diner and occupied the room like a weather system, she saw something she had not expected. Not softness, exactly. Something older and more reliable than softness. The specific steadiness of a person who has survived enough to no longer be afraid of the kind of pain that comes from standing next to someone else's grief. She reached out and straightened the collar of his black shirt. It was a mother's gesture, automatic, and she did it before she thought about it. He did not step back from it. "Shoulders back," she said quietly. "You're a proud son, and today I am a proud mother." Hank Decker Ironside, president of the Barstow Charter, a man who had spent 30 years being the person in the room that other people arranged themselves around, looked at this 73-year-old woman in her gray sweater with her dead husband's pin on her lapel and nodded once. Retta Voss pushed open the heavy blue doors of VFW Post 404. The warmth hit them, first the warmth of a room full of old people and old stories, and the specific heat generated by the effort of remembering. Then the smell lemon floor wax coffee, the rich, slow aroma of a crock pot that had been running since morning. Then the sound, 40 voices, rising and falling, the cadence of men catching up on a year's worth of living. And then cutting through all of it, a voice she would have recognized in a hurricane. Retta Voss, I'll be damned. Raymond Gundog Price was rolling toward her in his motorized wheelchair, the clear oxygen tube running from his nose to the green tank strapped to the chair's back. He was thin now, thinner than last year, thinner than the year before, his body slowly renegotiating its terms with the world. But his eyes were exactly what they had always been. Sharp and dark and lit from behind with the stubborn, enduring intelligence of a man who had survived the Chorwin Valley and 4 subsequent decades of being Raymond Price. Flanking him, Salvatore Mancetti, leaning on his silver-tipped cane with the composed patience of a man who had made peace with slowing down. And Birch Holloway, the left sleeve of his flannel shirt pinned up at the elbow, raising his remaining hand in a wave. And behind Raymond's wheelchair, hanging back slightly, the expression on his face one of polite assessing neutrality, Prescott Weiland, 45 years old, expensive wool coat, the eyes of a man who processed the world in terms of acquisition and liability. Retta felt Ironside's arms settle across her shoulders, steady, unhurried, completely natural. Mom, he said, one word, the right word, delivered with a certainty that required no support. Retta Voss smiled at Raymond Price, and the smile was real. The way smiles are real when they are built on top of terror and come out the other side as something almost indistinguishable from genuine. Raymond, she said, I want you to meet my son. Raymond Price looked up at Ironside the way he had always looked at things that required assessment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned at great cost that the difference between a correct read and an incorrect one was sometimes the difference between walking away and not walking away at all. He took his time. His eyes moved from the top of Ironside's shaved head down to the heavy work boots, pausing at the tattooed forearms, the jagged scar through the eyebrow, the width of the shoulders, that made the space between the wheelchair and the nearest folding table feel suddenly inadequate. Then Raymond looked at Retta, then back at Ironside. Well, he said, your mother always told us you were a big boy. A sound moved through the small group. Sal chuckling into his chest, Birch's mouth pulling sideways in the way it did when something landed right. The tension in the room, which had arranged itself around the arrival of this enormous stranger, eased a fraction. Ironside stepped forward and reached down, and Raymond Price, who had shaken the hands of generals and gravediggers and everyone in between, received a handshake that was firm and deliberate and held for exactly the right number of seconds. Not the cursory grip of a man being polite. The handshake of someone who understood that to an old soldier how you shook hands was a statement of character. Sir, Ironside said, my mother has been telling me about Gundog Price since I was old enough to listen. It's an honor. Raymond's chest expanded slightly, the way chests do when something lands exactly where it needed to land. Your daddy was the best man I ever served with, Raymond said, and his voice dropped a register, as it always did when he talked about Dale. We lost too many good ones over there. Dale was the best of them. He reached out and gripped Retta's hand briefly. She kept his memory alive better than any of us. You know that, son? I know it, Ironside said. Every single day. Retta kept her eyes straight ahead and her expression composed and did not allow herself to feel in this moment the specific cruelty of hearing the right words come from the wrong mouth. There would be time for that later. There was always time for the hard things later. Right now, she was a mother at her son's side, and she had decided to be that fully for as long as it lasted. Sal Mancetti moved forward on his cane, extending his free hand. He was a compact man, northeastern Italian in his bearing, dark eyes, a mouth that defaulted to skepticism, but could warm quickly, and he looked at Ironside with the frank, appraising directness of someone who had spent a lifetime in rooms where pretension was a liability. Sal Mancetti, he said, your mother used to write us about you. The architecture thing, big firm up in Saddle. He tilted his head. You don't look like you spend much time behind a drafting table. He's right, Ironside said easily. He shifted slightly so that his arm remained across Retta's shoulders, the small continuous signal of a man anchoring himself to his story through the physical fact of proximity. I don't, not anymore. I left the firm about 5 years ago. couldn't sit still long enough to make it work. Sal raised an eyebrow. What do you do now? Build motorcycles, custom fabrication frames, engines, bodywork. I've got a shop down in San Bernardino. He paused and something in his delivery slowed, became more deliberate. The way a man sounds when he shifts from performance to something closer to truth. I know it's not what my mother told you all I'd be doing. He glanced at Retta then, and the glance was brief and loaded with something that could, to anyone watching, have been read as the gentle, complicated affection of a son who has renegotiated his identity in his mother's eyes and is still, after all this time, checking that she has truly accepted it. Retta looked back at him and said nothing, which was the right answer. Good for you, Birch Holloway said from his place at the edge of the group, raising his remaining hand with the emphasis of a man who means it. Honest work, work you can stand in front of and see at the end of the day. Nothing wrong with grease under your nails. He looked at Retta. Smart boy, Retta. The group moved toward the banquet tables. The hall was fuller now, close to 40 people. The reunion drawing in not just the surviving members of Dale Voss's platoon, but their wives and children and grandchildren, the living sprawl of the levees those men had come home to build. American flags hung from the ceiling at regular intervals, and along the walls, photographs black and white, mostly the tonal range narrow, the faces impossibly young. Men in fatigue squinting into Korean sun, men grouped around equipment, around vehicles, around each other, in the easy, unconscious intimacy of people who have learned that closeness is a form of survival. Retta had seen these photographs every year for 15 years. Every year they hit her differently. Today they hit her like something structural giving way. She found a seat at the long table closest to the photographs. Ironside pulled out her chair without being asked, which drew a look of approval from Raymond that he did not bother to conceal. Then Ironside settled into the chair beside her and accepted a cup of coffee from a volunteer in a VFW auxiliary vest, and the meal began. For an hour, Loretta Voss lived inside a dream she had built herself, and like all dreams she had built herself, it was simultaneously exactly what she had wanted and quietly unbearable. Ironside was extraordinary at it, not in the way of an actor performing, in the way of a man who had spent his adult life reading rooms and understanding people, and knowing with the particular intelligence of someone who had survived on his wits exactly what each situation required. He talked to Sal about engine mechanics, and Sal, who had spent 30 years as a machinist before his retirement, lit up like a man who had been handed back something he had missed. He listened to Birch's stories about the early days of post-war California with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who understood that being listened to was for old men one of the rarest and most valued currencies available. With Raymond, he was different, quieter, more careful. Raymond asked questions not aggressively, but with the persistent curiosity of a man who had built his understanding of the world through rigorous inquiry, and Ironside answered them in a way that was always true adjacent and always grounded in something real. The motorcycle shop existed. The decision to leave a desk job existed. The choice to work with his hands rather than with a computer existed. The skeleton of the story was entirely honest. Only the name on the door was wrong. Retta watched him. She ate without tasting the food. She responded to questions directed at her. She laughed when laughter was appropriate. She placed her hand on Ironside's forearm twice in the way mothers do when they want to anchor themselves to their children in public spaces, and both times he covered her hand briefly with his without looking at her, as naturally as breathing. This is what it could have been, she thought, if she had not fallen apart after Gerald died, if she had been strong enough to grieve cleanly rather than chemically, if she had been the mother Callum needed instead of the burden he had eventually been unable to carry. If the man sitting beside her today were actually her son, broad and capable and comfortable in rooms full of men who needed handling, and comfortable beside her and willing to be seen with her. She pressed the thought flat. This was not the moment. But the thought left a mark the way true things always leave marks, regardless of whether you are ready for them. Near the end of the meal, as the plates were being cleared and the coffee refilled, and the room settled into the looser, warmer register of a gathering that has gotten past the formal part and arrived at the part where people say the things they actually came to say, the VFW post commander, a heavy-set man named Vic Thurston, who wore his service ribbons on a blazer that had been slightly too small for him for several years, moved to the front of the room and picked up a small brass bell. He rang it twice. The room quieted. We do this every year, Vic said, and every year it gets harder, and every year it matters more. So I'm going to ask you to give me your attention for a few minutes, and we're going to take a moment for the ones who aren't with us today. He lifted a sheet of paper. The roll call of the dead. He read 7 names, 7 men from the platoon who had passed in the last 12 months. 7 names read into the silence of a room full of people who had known them, some for 50 years, some for 70, some since they were boys who had not yet learned what they were capable of enduring. Retta had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point slightly above the line of photographs along the wall. She had heard her share of roll calls. She knew how to receive them. Vijayamar Ironside stood. He didn't make a production of it. He simply stood straightened to his full height, hands clasped in front of him, head slightly bowed. Around him others stood as well, but Retta noticed that Ironside stood before any of them without waiting to see what the room would do, without calculation. It was the reflex of a man who had attended his own roll calls and understood in his body rather than his mind what the ritual was asking. When Vic read the 7th name and folded his paper, he looked out at the room, and his eyes settled briefly on Ironside, this large stranger in the black shirt, and something passed across Vic's face that was not suspicion, but its opposite, the recognition of a man who understands a gesture and is grateful for it. Retta looked up at Ironside's profile. His jaw was set and his eyes were focused somewhere she could not see. Whatever he was looking at, it was not in this room. She thought about what he had said in the diner. His father dying in a VA hospital in Riverside in 1987. A son in county lockup unable to get to him in time. The weight of a reconciliation that had never been allowed to happen because the time ran out before either party found the courage. She thought about how many people in this room were carrying some version of that same stone. She thought about Callum. The roll call ended, people sat, conversation resumed. Someone brought out a sheet cake with a flag on it and the number 50 in blue frosting, and the room found its warmth again, the way rooms do when they have absorbed something hard and decided together to keep going. Raymond wheeled himself toward the cake table. Sal and Birch drifted with him. Ironside leaned close to Retta and said quietly, "You all right?" "I'm here," she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He nodded. He understood the distinction. And then the front doors of the hall opened. The cold came in first, a gust of November desert air that moved the nearest flag and rustled the banner above the doors. Then the man. He was 45 years old, though he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who believed himself younger. An expensive wool peacoat, charcoal gray, the kind that costs more than most people's monthly car payment. A suit beneath it, well cut, understated the suit of a man who wants to communicate success without appearing to try. His shoes were Italian and recently polished and wholly impractical for a gravel parking lot, which suggested he had come directly from the airport. He scanned the room with the trained efficiency of a man who spent his days walking into spaces and rapidly assessing their value. And when his eyes found Raymond Price's wheelchair, he moved toward it with a smile that was practiced, but not entirely without warmth. "Sorry I'm late, Uncle Ray." He bent and kissed the old man's cheek. "Flight out of Seattle was delayed 2 hours, and the rental car people lost my reservation entirely. I had to take a rideshare." "Prescott." Raymond gripped the younger man's arm with the affection of genuine family connection, the kind that survives distance and long gaps between visits. "You made it. That's what matters." He turned the wheelchair toward Retta's table. "Come here. I want you to meet Retta Voss. You've heard me talk about Dale." Prescott Weiland turned toward Retta with a polished smile. "Mrs. Voss," he said, extending a hand, "Uncle Ray talks about your husband with so much admiration." "It's a real honor." "Thank you for coming," Retta said. Her voice did not shake. She shook his hand. Then Prescott's eyes moved to Ironside. The polished smile held its shape, but something behind it shifted. The quality of his attention changed the way a man's attention changes when he encounters something that doesn't fit the pattern he was expecting, and he isn't sure yet whether it matters. "And this must be your son," Prescott said. "Uncle Ray mentioned you were coming." He extended his hand. "Prescott Weiland. I'm in commercial real estate development, mostly Seattle, some Portland. Your mother says you're in architecture." Ironside shook the hand. His grip was measured firm enough to be unambiguous, controlled enough to communicate that he was choosing how hard to squeeze. "Was in architecture," he said. Left the firm 5 years ago, building motorcycles now down in San Bernardino. Prescott tilted his head slightly, a small recalibration. Interesting change of direction, he said. His eyes moved briefly and without apparent intention to the edge of ink visible above Ironside's collar. Which firm were you with up in Seattle? Crestwood Associates, Retta said. The name had come from a magazine article she had read in a dentist's waiting room in 2009 and filed away in the lie she was building. She had used it every year since. Prescott Weiland was quiet for 1 second. It was a specific kind of quiet. The quiet of a man processing information against existing information and finding that they do not align. Crestwood Associates, he said again. His voice had not changed, but something underneath it had. Raymond was talking to Sal across the table. Birch was getting cake. The conversation around them was loud enough that what Prescott said next was available only to the three of them. He leaned forward, very slightly, and dropped his voice to a register that was professional and precise and entirely without the social warmth of a moment ago. That's interesting, he said, because my firm acquired Crestwood's commercial division in 2021. I went through every personnel file during the acquisition audit. I know the people who were at that firm. His eyes moved between Retta and Ironside with the careful deliberateness of a man who is constructing something as he speaks. I don't remember seeing you in any of the senior staff documentation. Retta felt the table edge under her fingers. Ironside said nothing. He held Prescott's gaze with a steadiness that gave nothing away. Like I said, Ironside said, I left the firm 5 years ago, before your acquisition. Right. Prescott nodded slowly, the gesture of a man agreeing to a premise he does not accept. See, the thing is, the acquisition files went back 10 years. Standard due diligence. He paused. There was a Callum Voss in the Crestwood records. Junior draftsman, not senior architect. Retta's grip on the table edge tightened until the blood left her fingers. And he didn't leave voluntarily, Prescott continued, his voice dropping further, his eyes on Retta now, with something that was not quite cruelty but was not mercy either, the flat, assessing gaze of a man delivering findings. He was terminated in the spring of 2021. The reason listed in the HR file was financial misconduct, specifically the misappropriation of approximately $50,000 in client retainer funds. He let that land. The money was used to purchase controlled substances. There was a subsequent federal investigation. Retta did not move. The room around her continued, the voices, the silverware, the flags shifting in the air from the heating vent, and none of it touched her. She existed for this moment in the specific silence that descends when the thing you have most feared for 15 years steps out of the abstract and into the concrete and stands in front of you in an expensive peacoat. And I remember now, Prescott added, his voice dropping further, still something shifting in his expression from the clinical to the uncomfortable. He came to my office. Must have been 20, 22, a few months after the termination. He asked to see me personally. He looked he wasn't well. He wanted to know if there was any kind of work, anything at all. I had my assistant tell him we weren't hiring. He paused. Something in his jaw tightened. I didn't come out of my office. The addition landed differently than everything else he had said. It landed on him as much as it landed on Retta. Prescott Easton, standing in his expensive coat, had just told a room the thing he had not planned to tell, the detail that had apparently sat in him since 2022, and had chosen this moment in this VFW hall to surface. Federal investigation, Ironside said. His voice was very quiet now. Not the quiet of a man retreating, the quiet of a man who has decided to become very still before he moves. Pelican Bay. Prescott blinked. It was the first time since walking across the room that something had genuinely surprised him. That's how would you know? The scar on his chin, Ironside said. Left-handed, wire-rimmed glasses, about 5'10", 160 when he went in, probably 140 by the time he got processed. His jaw tightened. That's Callum Voss. Prescott stared at him. Retta turned to look at Ironside. Something in her chest had gone very still. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a woman who has just heard a sound in the dark and is waiting to understand what made it. How do you know what my son looked like? She said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Ironside did not look at Prescott again. He turned to Retta, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen there before. The stern, controlled architecture of it had shifted, not crumbled, but changed the way a face changes when it stops managing itself and becomes something rawer and more expensive. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. He set it on the table between them. A photograph. Small, wallet-sized, the edges soft and worn from handling. Two young men standing in front of a garage bay laughing. The same photograph that had fallen from his wallet in the diner. The same photograph she had glimpsed for a moment before he tucked it away. Up close in the light of the VFW hall, she could see what she had not been able to see from across the diner floor. The man with the scar on his chin, the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders in the way of someone who has recently learned to carry them back rather than forward. The open quality of the laugh of a man who had climbed back from somewhere dark and was still surprised every time to find light on the other side. Not Gerald's laugh. Callum's. Retta picked up the photograph. Her hands were completely steady. She had spent 50 years making her hands steady. Mrs. Voss, Ironside said, quietly. Callum Voss was my cellmate at Pelican Bay State Prison. Block C, 18 months. His voice did not soften. It could not do that. It was not built for that. But it slowed, and in the slowing there was a care that communicated more than softness could have. He went in terrified and half dead from withdrawal, and he should not have survived the first week. He's alive because I made sure he was alive. A pause. And your son is not in Seattle. The room continued around them. Somewhere across the hall, Raymond was laughing at something Sal had said. The flag above them shifted in the heating vent's breath. Someone's grandchild was running between tables and being redirected by a firm parental voice. Prescott Weiland stood at the edge of this moment with the expression of a man who had come to this reunion expecting to spend 2 hours making polite conversation and had instead walked into something he did not have the context to process. The practiced confidence had evacuated his face entirely. What was left was a man who was 30 years younger than most people in this room and looked for the first time today, genuinely his age and not entirely comfortable with what that meant. Retta set the photograph down. She placed it precisely back on the table in front of Ironside, aligned with the edge. She did this with great care, the way you handle things that belong to other people. Then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. The shame was total. It was not the sharp, acute shame of a specific mistake, but the deep, slow shame of a pattern, years and years of choices that had each seemed manageable in isolation and had accumulated into this. Into sitting in a VFW hall in Barstow, California, at 73 years old, and learning from a stranger that her son had gone to prison, and she had not known because she had been too afraid to look. Ironside stood slowly to his full height. He positioned himself with a deliberateness that was entirely intentional between Retta and Prescott and between Retta and the room. His back to the hall, his shoulders blocking the sightlines of anyone who might be beginning to notice that something at this table had shifted. He looked at Prescott, Weiland with the ice blue eyes that had an hour ago made the entire diner rearrange itself. You did your audit, Ironside said. His voice was low enough that it did not carry beyond the four of them, but it had the quality of something that fills a space entirely regardless of its volume. You found the numbers that didn't balance. You found the name attached to them, and you put it in a file, and you moved on to the next acquisition. He paused. What you didn't find was a man who had spent his whole life inside the shadow of a dead man's legacy, trying to be something large enough to deserve the grief his mother had carried for 30 years. You didn't find the person who sat on a concrete floor at Pelican Bay and shook for 3 days while his body tried to remember how to exist without the thing he had given it to kill the noise. Prescott was very still. You found a liability in a personnel file, Ironside said, and you didn't come out of your office. He let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. So take your coat and go get some cake. We're done here. Prescott Weiland looked at Ironside for a long moment. Then he looked at Retta, and in that look something moved that was neither the developer's calculation nor the smooth authority he had walked in with. Something that might in a different life with more practice have found its way to becoming an apology. He nodded once and moved away without another word. Ironside remained standing until Prescott had been absorbed back into the room. Then he pulled his chair close to Retta's and sat and leaned forward so his voice reached only her. I need to tell you something, he said. You already told me. Ipam, Retta said. No, he said. I told you where he was. I haven't told you where he is. She looked up at him. When Callum got out, Ironside said he had a felony record and a history of addiction and nowhere to go. His parole conditions required a stable address and verified employment. Without those two things, he'd have been back inside in 60 days. He held her gaze. I brought him to my shop. I gave him the address and the job. He started sweeping floors 18 months ago. Right now, he is building custom motorcycle frames in San Bernardino, and he has been clean for 4 years, 3 months, and 19 days. The VFW hall went on around them. Retta Voss sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to a man she had met 1 hour and 40 minutes ago tell her that her son was alive and working and sober and 19 days further from the darkness than he had been 19 days ago. She had not allowed herself to cry in a public space since Gerald's funeral in 2005. She did not cry now. But something in her face changed, some arrangement of muscle and expression that had been holding a specific shape for a very long time, and the change was visible. And Raymond Price, watching from across the table with eyes that were still, after 70 years, as sharp as they had ever been, saw it. He wheeled himself over. Retta, he said. His voice was gentle in the way that blunt men are occasionally unexpectedly gentle when they understand that gentleness is the only tool that will work. Retta, what is it? What's happened? Retta looked at Raymond. She looked at Sal, who had followed, at Birch, who stood just behind them both. She had carried this lie for 15 years. She had carried it with both hands and refused to set it down, because setting it down meant looking at what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was the fear that she had failed everyone who had ever depended on her. Dale, whose sacrifice she had been supposed to honor Gerald, whose patience she had repaid by falling apart. Callum, whose childhood she had been too busy surviving to protect. She looked at Ironside. He met her eyes and gave her nothing, no instruction, no rescue. Only the steady, blue-eyed presence of a man who had decided to stand beside her and was prepared to keep standing. She turned back to Raymond. I owe you the truth, she said. I owe all of you the truth. The table went quiet. Callum is not an architect in Seattle, she said. He has not been an architect in Seattle. I built that story because I needed you to believe that Dale's legacy had come to something good. Because every year I came here and looked at Dale's photograph on that wall, and I could not let you see that I had spent 30 years after him making decisions that cost our family more than the war had. Her voice was steady. She kept it steady. Callum went through things that I won't describe here. He is alive, he is well, he is working, and he is sober, and he is alive. That is the truth. Everything else I told you was what I wished were true, and I am sorry. The silence that followed was not the silence of judgment. Raymond Price looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand in his spotted liver-age grip and held it with the firmness of a man who has made a decision and intends to keep it. Did you think, he said slowly, that you were the only one? Sal let out a long breath through his nose. My daughter hasn't returned my calls since 2001, Raymond said. I did something when she was 17 that I have spent 20 years trying to find the words for. I have not found them yet. His grip on her hand tightened. I come here every year and I talk about Dale, and I do not talk about Eleanor, because Eleanor is the thing I cannot make right, and this room is the one place I still feel like a man who did something that mattered. Birch Holloway pressed his one remaining hand flat against the table. I wasn't in combat when I lost this arm, he said quietly. I was drunk. 2 years after I came home from Korea, single car accident on the 15 outside Victorville. I have told people for 60 years that it happened overseas. He looked at the pinned sleeve. Easier than the truth. Salman said he said nothing for a moment. Then 3 marriages, Retta? 3. I don't know which one I deserved least. Raymond looked at Ironside. You're not her son, he said. It was not a question. Ironside held the old man's gaze. No, sir, he said. I'm not. Raymond studied him for another long moment. The oxygen hissed quietly. The flag above them shifted. But you know where he is, Raymond said. Yes, sir. Raymond Price nodded, the slow, certain nod of a man who has been a soldier and a commander and a widower and a failure and a survivor long enough to understand that the only posture remaining available in the face of a fully lived life is forward. Then what are you still doing sitting here, he said. He released Retta's hand. Ironside looked at Retta. Retta looked at the photograph still lying on the table between them. Her son, 4 years and 3 months and 19 days from the worst of himself, laughing in the sun. And she picked it up carefully and held it for a moment, and then placed it back in Ironside's hand. Take me to him, she said. The desert between Barstow and San Bernardino is not the romantic desert of postcards and country songs. It is the working desert scrub brush in transmission towers, in the bleached concrete of the Interstate 15 cutting through terrain that has never pretended to be anything other than what it is. Harsh, indifferent, honest in the way that only empty places can be honest because they have nothing to sell you and no reason to perform. Ironside drove with one hand on the wheel of his truck, a matte black, heavy-duty Silverado that smelled of motor oil and old leather, and faintly the specific metallic cold of a vehicle that lives outside. The engine was large and ran quietly the way well-maintained, powerful things run quietly, with a deep competence that did not need to announce itself. Retta sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the Mojave go by. She had said goodbye to Raymond at the VFW hall doors. He had held her hand for a moment and looked at her with those dark, exhausted, stubborn eyes and said nothing, which was the right thing. Sal had patted her shoulder twice. Birch had walked her to the door and said quietly that she should bring Callum to the Christmas gathering in December, and the casualness of the invitation, its assumption that there would be something to bring, that the story would continue forward from here, had hit her somewhere behind the sternum with a force that she was still feeling. Prescott Whelan had not said goodbye. She had not looked for him. But as she and Ironside reached the VFW doors, she had glanced back once and seen him standing alone near the far wall, his expensive coat over his arm, looking at the black and white photographs of young men in Korean fatigues with an expression she could not fully read from across the room. She had turned away before she could decide what it meant. Now the town fell away behind them, and the highway opened up, and Ironside drove, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that two people arrive at when they have moved past the need to fill space with sound. 11 miles out of Barstow, Retta said, "Tell me about him." Ironside didn't ask who she meant. "He came in on a Tuesday," he said. "Late October 2 years ago. They processed the new arrivals in the morning, but something got held up with his paperwork, and they didn't move him to Block C until almost 9 at night. I heard him before I saw him. They were walking him down the corridor, and he was trying not to make noise. And that's the thing about trying not to make noise in a place like that. The effort of it is louder than the noise would have been. He shifted lanes to pass a semi-smooth and automatic. He was 140, maybe 145. He had been through a detox facility for 30 days before sentencing, but his body hadn't forgiven him yet. You could see it the way he moved, the way his hands wouldn't stay still. He had the glasses wire-rimmed, one arm cracked and held together with electrical tape. He had the scar on his chin from a car accident, he told me later, not from anything that happened inside. Retta listened without speaking. They put him in the bunk above mine. He climbed up and lay down, and I could hear him breathing in the dark, the specific way a person breathes when they are trying to make themselves small enough that whatever is in the room with them won't notice. I have heard that breathing before. I used to breathe that way myself a long time ago in a different kind of room. He paused. The highway stretched ahead perfectly straight. I told him first night 2 things. I told him that nobody in Block C would touch him as long as he was under my protection. And I told him that protection was not free. The cost of it was that he had to eat every meal, show up to every work assignment, and stay alive. That was the deal. Ironside's jaw shifted. He asked me why. I told him I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. Did you figure it out? Retta asked. He was quiet for a moment. He reminded me of what I used to be before I decided that softness was a liability I couldn't afford, he said. He had this quality, even this sick, even scared, even in the worst circumstances you can put a person in of paying attention to things. He would notice how the light came through the cell window at a certain angle in the morning. He would describe the geometry of the exercise yard like he was seeing a building nobody else had bothered to design. He was still looking at the world like it had structure worth understanding, even from inside a cage. A pause. I had stopped doing that a long time ago. Watching him do it was like being reminded of a language I used to speak. The Mojave slid past, a cluster of Joshua trees. A billboard for a casino 60 miles south, the shadow of a hawk crossing the highway in a slow tilting glide. He talked about you, Ironside said. Retta turned to look at him. Not immediately. The first few months, he didn't talk much at all. He was getting his footing, learning the rhythms of the place, doing what he needed to do to get through each day. But around month 4, when the worst of the physical part was behind him, and he started sleeping more than 2 hours at a stretch, he started to talk. Ironside's hand moved on the steering wheel, a small adjustment. He talked about architecture, the actual work of it, the way load and weight and material interact, the problem of making something that has to hold up against the world. He could talk about that for an hour and make it sound like poetry. He glanced at her briefly, then back to the road. And he talked about you. What did he say? Her voice was quiet and careful, voice of a woman who has learned not to brace too obviously for impact. He said you were the strongest person he had ever known, Ironside said. He said you had buried 2 husbands and raised him mostly alone and worked every year of your life and never once asked anyone to acknowledge how hard it was. He said that was both the thing he admired most about you and the thing that had made it impossible when he was struggling to tell you the truth, because you had never given him permission to be something that needed saving. The words settled in the truck cab and stayed there. Retta looked out at the desert. He said the last time he spoke to you, 2012, a phone call in the spring, he had tried to tell you something was wrong, that he was not managing, that he needed help of a kind he didn't know how to ask for. Ironside paused. He said you told him you were fine and that you were managing and that things would get easier. He said that was the moment he understood that the 2 of you were going to drown separately rather than admit to each other that the water was rising. I was not fine, Retta said. I was not managing. I know. I was taking 4 different prescriptions and telling myself that was different from what he was doing because mine had a doctor's name on the bottle. She said it without inflection, the way you say things you have said so many times in so many church basements and therapists' offices that the saying of them no longer requires preparation. It was not different. It took me 3 more years to understand that, and by then I had no way to reach him. He knows, Ironside said. She turned to look at him again. He knows you're sober, Ironside said. He has known for at least 2 years. He has a friend from his NA group whose brother lives in Barstow. The brother knew you peripherally from the hardware store. I think you used to go in on Saturday mornings and mentioned in passing that the Voss widow was doing well, that she seemed different from how she had been in the bad years. He kept his eyes on the road. Callum asked me not to tell you he knew, but you're about to walk through a door, and I think you should walk through it with everything I have. Retta absorbed this. Her son had known she was clean. He had been carrying that knowledge for 2 years, had chosen to carry it in silence, rather than act on it, rather than call, rather than close the distance. Not because he didn't care, because caring after the kind of loss they had both sustained had become a risk that required more courage than either of them had been able to locate, until today. He's going to want to run, she said. Yes. Is there a back door to your shop? Something shifted at the corner of Ironside's mouth. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. There is, he said, but I'll park the truck across it. They drove in silence for a while. The Mojave began to give way to the first evidence of the Inland Empire, the gradual proliferation of rooftops and retail signs, and the complex geometry of freeway interchanges that signals the outer edge of Southern California sprawl. The light change softened by haze, the particular amber gray of a late afternoon in November, in a valley that holds its air close. Why the tattoo? Retta said. Ironside glanced at her. The name on your wrist, she said. Dale, I saw it clearly in the VFW hall. That's not a common name. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Callum talked about your first husband, he said finally, about the weight of him, about growing up in a house where a man's absence was somehow louder than most presences, the photographs, the pin you wore every day, the way you talked about him to his friends every year. He said he had spent his whole life trying to measure up to a ghost and had never understood that the ghost wasn't asking him to. He paused. He talked about Dale the way people talk about someone they have thought about for so long that the person has become part of the architecture of their own mind. And I thought there are men who die and get forgotten immediately, And there are men who day and go on shaping the living for 70 years. That seemed worth marking. Retta looked at the tattoo on his left wrist. The name in small, dark letters, the ink old and soft-edged. You put it on in prison, she said. 4 months in, he said. After the first night, Callum slept a full 6 hours. I took it as a sign that something was going to be all right. She looked at him. This man she had met 6 hours ago. This stranger who had taken off his insignia out of respect for dead soldiers he had never known who had sat beside her, through a roll call for men whose names meant nothing to him, and bowed his head because it was the right thing to do, who had carried her son's photograph in his wallet for 2 years and put the name of her first husband on his wrist because some men deserve to be remembered. And she thought about how the world persists in being stranger and more generous than you have any right to expect, especially in the moments when you have run out of road. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly, the small deflection of a man uncomfortable with gratitude directed at him personally. Don't thank me yet, he said. We're not through the hard part. The truck turned off the interstate onto a surface road that moved through an industrial district, the unglamorous infrastructure of a working city warehouses and fabrication shops in the occasional auto salvage yard behind chain-link fencing. The light was failing now, the November sun dropping fast toward the western hills, throwing long shadows across the road and painting the corrugated steel of the buildings in shades of copper and rust. Iron and Bone Custom Cycles occupied a warehouse at the end of a short access road set back from the street by a cracked concrete apron wide enough for 6 vehicles. The building was large and functional and bore the evidence of a business that was genuinely operating a row of motorcycles in various stages of construction, visible through the open bay doors, a parts inventory stacked on steel shelving, inside the overhead fluorescents burning bright against the darkening sky outside. Above the bay doors, a hand-painted sign in blocky black letters, Iron and Bone Custom Cycles Fabrication and Restoration, established in 2014. From inside the building, audible even from the parking apron, the sharp electric hiss of a welding torch. Ironside parked the truck sideways across the back of the apron, blocking the rear access door without comment. He cut the engine. They sat for a moment. He doesn't know you're coming, Ironside said. He knows I called. He knows I'm bringing someone. He doesn't know who. What did you tell him? I told him to put down his torch and wash his hands. He opened the driver's door. That was enough. They walked across the concrete apron. The cold had sharpened in the last hour of the desert evening, arriving with its customary lack of transition, warm to cold light to dark, the desert's version of a conversation that ends mid-sentence. Retta's orthopedic shoes were quiet on the concrete. Beside her, Ironside's heavy boots made the solid sound of a man who has never learned to move quietly and stopped trying years ago. He led her to the side door, a heavy steel door painted the same matte black as his truck, propped open slightly by a chunk of scrap iron. He pulled it open, and they stepped inside. The shop smelled of ozone and hot metal and the particular clean sharpness of fresh-cut steel. It was larger inside than it had appeared from the parking apron, the ceiling high, the space organized with a precision that was evident even to someone who knew nothing about motorcycle fabrication. Frames on hydraulic lifts arranged by stage of completion, tools on pegboards, each one in its designated space. A parts inventory system on a whiteboard near the office door, updated in careful block lettering. The shop of a man who had learned, probably through the costly experience of its opposite, that order was not optional. At the far end of the shop, a figure in heavy leather welding chaps stood beside a hydraulic lift, his back to the door. The welding mask pushed up on his forehead, a shop rag in both hands. He was wiping the rag between his palms in the automatic, habitual way of a man who has been doing this long enough that the motion requires no thought. Retta stopped breathing. She had been preparing for this moment for the 70-mile drive down the 15. She had rehearsed not words exactly, but postures, the arrangement of herself that she would bring into this room, the way she would stand and what her hands would do and how she would hold her face. She had thought she was ready. She was not ready. Callum Voss, at 38 years old, was not the boy she had last seen in her memory's imperfect preservation, nor the emaciated ghost that Ironside had described arriving at Pelican Bay. He was a man, entirely undeniably a man, and the transformation from the soft, tentative person she had last spoken to in 2012 to the figure standing across this workshop was so complete that for a moment she experienced a doubling of vision. Her memory of him overlaid on the reality of him, and the overlap was imperfect, and she had to adjust rapidly and without preparation to the fact that 13 years had made a stranger of her son without making him less her son. His shoulders were broad and carried back in the posture of someone who has done physical work long enough that the body has reorganized itself around the demands of that work. His hair, which had been sandy and soft when he was a boy, was cropped close at the sides and gone gray at the temples in a way that made him look like a man who had earned the gray honestly. Along his jawline, silver white against the stubble, the scar from a car accident in 2009, in the years before the worst of it, the years when the erosion was happening, slowly and invisibly, the way erosion always happens until the moment it doesn't. He turned to look at Ironside, and then his eyes moved with the sideways involuntary instinct of someone who has sensed a presence at the edge of their awareness to the figure standing beside Ironside in the doorway. The shop rag slipped from his hands. It hit the concrete floor with the soft, soundless collapse of something too light to make a proper landing. Callum's face did not change all at once. It changed in stages, the recognition arriving first in the eyes, then spreading outward in a wave that moved through his expression the way a stone's impact moves through still water. Shock first, then something rawer beneath it, something he had spent 13 years training himself not to show, and which showed now anyway because the body keeps its own accounts regardless of what the mind has decided. He took a step backward. His spine found the workbench behind him. "No," he said. The word was quiet and involuntary, less a statement than a reflex. "No." He looked at Ironside with an expression that held a quality Retta recognized, the look of a person who trusts someone completely and has just discovered that trust does not protect you from ambush. "Hank," his voice had risen slightly, "what did you do?" "What needed doing," Ironside said. His voice was calm and flat, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is not going to be argued out of it. "I told you." Callum pressed a hand against the workbench behind him, the gesture of a man stabilizing himself against something he cannot see. "I told you specifically. I told you I wasn't ready." Callum, Retta's voice, one word, his name, spoken the way she had spoken it 10,000 times across the span of his childhood, not loudly, not with command or demand, but with the specific quality of a voice that has shaped itself around a name for so long that the name and the voice have become inseparable. He closed his eyes. The workshop was quiet around them. Somewhere outside, a truck moved along the access road, and its headlights swept briefly across the high windows and disappeared. Retta did not cross the room. She understood with the particular understanding of a woman who has spent decades learning the cost of pushing too hard that the distance between them right now was his to manage. She had arrived. She was here. What happened with the distance was his choice to make. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm not here to explain myself or to ask you to absorb anything tonight that you can't absorb. I'm here because I ran out of reasons not to be." She paused. "I have been clean for 8 years. You knew that. I know you knew that. And I understand why knowing it wasn't enough. I understand why safety is different from sobriety and why a mother being sober is not the same as a mother being safe to need things from." Callum's eyes remained closed. His jaw was working. "I am not going to tell you that I have become something other than what I was," she continued. "I have become something better than what I was at my worst, which is a different and more honest claim. I still have the capacity to lean too hard on the people I love. I am still learning to apologize before the damage, rather than after it. I am 73 years old and I have not figured out how to be the mother you deserved when you were young enough to need it most." She reached into the pocket of her gray wool sweater. "I came here with 2 things," she said. "The first is this." She held up the Korean War Veterans Association pin, Dale's pin, the one she had worn on her lapel every day for 50 years. This belonged to Dale Voss, who died in Korea before either of us knew him, and whose absence shaped both our lives more than his presence ever could have. I have been wearing it since 1953 because I believed I owed it to him. She looked at the pin in her palm. "I have decided that the debt has been paid, that you should have it. Not because Dale was your father, he wasn't, Gerald was, and Gerald was a better father than either man's legend would probably allow anyone to admit. But because this pin is the last physical thing I have been holding on to keep myself from having to hold on to the actual living person I love, and I am tired of the substitution. She held it out. Callum opened his eyes. He looked at the pin. He looked at his mother. Something in his face moved through a sequence that lasted perhaps 5 seconds in covered terrain that would have taken years to describe in words: grief and anger and longing, and the specific terrible tenderness of someone who has spent 13 years building fortifications against a feeling that is now standing in their shop, holding out a piece of metal with both hands. "You said two things," he said. His voice was rough. "The second thing is this," Retta said. She reached back into her pocket and produced the second item, Gerald's watch. A simple Timex with a worn leather band, the face scratched from years of work, the kind of watch that does not announce itself. "Your father wore this every day for 30 years. He was wearing it the morning he went to the hospital for the last time. I should have given it to you when you were old enough to wear it. I kept it because I was not ready to give away the last warm thing." She held it out beside the pin. Callum pushed off from the workbench. He crossed the workshop in 5 steps. Long steps, the steps of a man who has made a decision and is moving before he can unmake it. And he stood in front of his mother, and he was nearly a foot taller than her now, this woman who had seemed so large when he was small. And he looked down at the two objects in her outstretched hands. He took them both. He held them for a moment, one in each hand, the pin and the watch. The two men who had preceded him in her life, reduced to these small objects, transferred now from her hands to his. Then his broad, grease-calloused hands closed around them, and his shoulders dropped, and he made a sound that was not quite a word, something below language, something from a register the body accesses only in extremis, when the structures it has built to manage feeling prove finally completely inadequate. Retta stepped forward and put her arms around her son. He was too large for the embrace she had available to offer him. She barely reached his shoulder, and her arms did not go all the way around the width of him, but she held on with the full strength of her 73-year-old body, which was not inconsiderable. And after a moment, his arms came around her, and he bent his head down, and she felt the weight of it against the top of hers, and the two of them stood in the middle of the motorcycle shop in the last of the November light, with the smell of hot metal and ozone around them, and the sound of the highway in the distance, and nothing else. She did not tell him it was all right. It was not all right, not entirely, not yet. There was too much ground between where they were and where all right would be located, and she had spent enough years in church basements to understand that the work of repair was long and nonlinear and could not be completed in a single afternoon in a San Bernardino warehouse. But he was here, he was warm. His heartbeat was steady against her cheek. She had needed to know he was breathing. He was breathing. That was enough for today. Hank Decker walked out. He did it quietly without announcement, the way he had been moving through other people's significant moments all his life, efficiently, without taking up more space than necessary, leaving cleanly when the moment no longer required his presence. The side door closed behind him with the soft, definitive sound of a man who knows when his work is done. Outside, the November evening had arrived fully. The sky above the industrial park had gone the deep bruised purple of desert dusk. Not quite dark, not quite light, the brief window of color that the Mojave opens every evening and closes again before most people think to look. He leaned against the passenger side of his truck and pulled a pack of Marlboros from his jacket pocket and lit one, cupping the flame against the wind. He smoked and looked at the sky. He thought about Prescott Weiland, standing alone at the far wall as they left, looking at the photographs of men he had never known with the expression of someone discovering unexpectedly and too late that an accounting was coming that he had not prepared for. He thought about his father, Edward Raymond Decker, born 1930 in Fontana, California, inducted into the United States Army in 1950. Korea, the Punch Bowl sector, 20 months of cold and noise, in the specific education that combat provides in the fragility of the things you were certain of before you went. Discharged 1952. Dead 1987 in the VAA hospital in Riverside, alone in a room on the 3rd floor while his son sat in county lockup 60 miles away on a weapons charge and did not know the man was dying until the man was already 3 days in the ground. Hank had been carrying that stone for 37 years. Not guilt exactly, he had done enough work in enough different circumstances over the decades to understand that guilt is only useful as long as it is pointing somewhere actionable. What he carried was something more specific and harder to name. The weight of a conversation that had not happened because neither party had been capable of initiating it. His father had not known how to ask for forgiveness. He had not known how to offer it. They had existed in the unresolved space between those two incapacities for 27 years, until time made the resolution impossible by eliminating one of the parties. He had put the name on his wrist because Callum had talked about Dale Voss the way Hank had never been able to talk about his own father, with grief that had been processed enough to become something complicated and workable, rather than just raw and useless. With the hard-won understanding arrived at in a concrete cell at great personal cost that the men who shape you are not required to be adequate in order to matter. Hank had not arrived at that understanding about his own father. He was not certain, standing here in the parking apron of his own shop with his cigarette burning down between his fingers, that he was capable of it. But he was beginning to suspect that incapability was not a permanent condition. It was a position, and positions could be changed if you were willing to move. He finished the cigarette, crushed it under his boot. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He stood with it in his hand for a moment, looking at the screen without touching it, the way you stand at the edge of something before you decide to step. Then he opened the browser and typed a National Cemetery, Riverside, California. The page loaded. He read the visiting hours. He found the interment record search. He typed a name, Edward Raymond Decker. The search returned a result in 11 seconds. Section 14, Row C, Plot 447. He stared at the information on the screen for a long time. He had not visited the grave, not once in 37 years. He had told himself various things about why over the years that he did not believe in the ritual, that standing in front of a stone marker and talking to the ground was performance, rather than grief that his father would not have wanted it. He had told himself these things with the practiced conviction of a man who has repeated something often enough that it has started to function like truth. He understood now, standing in the parking apron of his own shop with the sound of his cellmate's reunion with his mother, audible faintly through the steel wall behind him, that none of those things had been the real reason. The real reason was simpler and less defensible. He had not visited because visiting meant arriving at the unresolved conversation with nowhere left to go, and he was not sure what he would find there, whether it would be relief or rage or grief or something else entirely. Something he had no name for yet, because he had been too careful for too long to get close enough to find out. He looked at Section 14, Row C, Plot 447 on his phone screen. Then he opened his contacts and found Cole. Cole picked up on the second ring. "You good?" "Fine it," Hank said. "Take the guys back to Barstow. I'll be back tonight." A pause. "You need anything?" "No." Another pause, the particular pause of a man who wants to ask a question and has spent enough years working alongside Hank Decker to know that some questions are better held. "All right," Cole said. "Ride safe." Hank ended the call. He stood in the parking apron with the purple sky above him and the highway noise in the distance and the desert cold finding the gaps in his jacket. He thought about what Retta had said at the VFW hall door before they went in, straightening his collar with the automatic gesture of a woman who had spent her life tending to people and could not stop even when she was running on empty. Shoulders back. "You're a proud son." He had spent 37 years declining to be his father's son in any way he was willing to claim. Not the son of the ghost who sat in rooms without being present, not the son of the man who had made the house feel like a place to leave rather than a place to stay, not the son who had been in a cage 60 miles away when the man died alone. He was not sure what he was willing to be now, but for the first time in 37 years, he was willing to find out. That was new. That was something. The side door of the shop opened. Retta stepped out into the evening air. She had been inside for 40 minutes. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her face was composed in the way it had been composed all day, the hard-won composure of a woman who had earned the right to feel things without being destroyed by them. The Korean War pin was back on her lapel. She had kept it after all, or Callum had given it back. Hank would learn later that they had agreed to share custody of it, alternating who carried it, a small agreement between two people who were just beginning the long work of learning how to belong to each other again. She stood beside him without speaking for a moment, looking at the purple sky. "He wants to show me the frame he's been working on," she said. "He's been designing it for 6 months. He says the geometry of the neck angle is the most elegant problem he has ever solved." A pause. "He said he wishes he could show Gerald." Hank said nothing. There was nothing adequate to add to that. "He'll come to Raymond's Christmas gatherings," she said. "He asked me to tell Raymond that he's sorry it took this long and that he'd like to hear everything Raymond remembers about Dale, if Raymond is willing." "Raymond will be willing," Hank said. She looked at him. "What about you?" He turned his head. "Where do you go now?" she asked. While intrusively, the question of a woman who has spent the day watching a man give away things he did not announce and who has the decency to acknowledge it. He looked at his phone, still in his hand, the VA cemetery page still on the screen. He turned it so she could see it. She looked at the screen. She looked at the name in the search result. Edward Raymond Decker. She did not say anything for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a woman who understands what she is looking at. Then she reached out and put her hand briefly over his, the same gesture she had used that morning, straightening his collar, the automatic, unassuming touch of a woman who has spent her life tending to people and cannot stop even when she is exhausted. "Go," she said. "Go tonight, before you talk yourself out of it." He looked at her. "You won't know what you find until you get there," she said. "But you already know that not going costs you something you can't keep paying." He put the phone back in his pocket. The shop door opened, and Callum appeared in the doorway, still in his welding chaps. The shop rag tucked in his back pocket, his father's Timex already on his wrist, the band slightly loose on a wrist that would need it shortened. He looked at Hank with the particular expression of a man who owes a debt so large he doesn't know where to start with it, and has decided for now to let his presence speak for everything words couldn't reach. "I need to borrow your mom for a few more minutes," Callum said. "She needs to see this frame." Hank looked at Retta, then at Callum. "Take your time," he said. Callum nodded. The two men held each other's gaze for a moment, the long, wordless exchange of people who have lived in close proximity to each other's worst and managed to come out the other side of it, still standing still, willing to occupy the same room, and then Callum stepped back inside. Retta looked up at Hank one more time. "Shoulders back," she said quietly. He almost smiled. He got in the truck and started the engine and pulled out of the parking apron onto the access road and then onto the surface road and then onto the on-ramp of the 215 heading south toward Riverside. The highway was busy in the early evening, the headlights of 10,000 cars running in both directions. Through the dark, everybody in motion, everybody carrying the specific weight of their particular life. Hank drove with both hands on the wheel. He noticed this without deciding it, the way you notice a change in your body that happened without your permission, and the radio stayed off, and the heater ran against the desert cold, and the miles went by. He drove for 30 minutes. The Riverside National Cemetery was closed to vehicles after 5, but the pedestrian gate was open and the grounds were not empty. A few figures moved among the stones in the failing light, small and quiet in the large ordered geometry of the place. The white markers in their precise rows extended across the hillside in every direction, identical and immovable, the organized democracy of the dead. Hank parked in the lot and walked through the gate. Section 14 was uphill and to the east. He walked to it with his phone screen as a light counting the rows in the dark, finding the plot. The grass was cold and slightly damp, and his boots were heavy on it, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the freeway and the faint shift of the wind through the trees at the cemetery's edge. He found it. Edward Raymond Decker, 1930-1987, United States Army, Korean War. The stone was simple and government issue identical to the thousands around it. White marble, standard dimensions, the name and dates and service branch cut into it with the impersonal precision of a system that processes grief at scale. There was no individual flourish, no room for it, just the facts of a life reduced to what the country considered worth recording. Hank stood in front of it. He had carried a version of this moment in him for 37 years, had imagined it on the rare occasions he allowed himself to as something dramatic. An arrival, a confrontation even with the cold marble fact of what had been lost and what had been wasted. He had imagined it requiring something large from him. It did not require something large. What it required was simply that he be here, present. in the specific location where his father's name had been cut into stone and left to weather the years that his son had spent not coming. That was all. Just the being here, the closing of the distance, the willingness to stand in the dark in a place he had avoided for 37 years and let the avoidance end. He thought about a man sitting in rooms without being present. He thought about the particular damage that does not the explosive damage of violence, which at least announces itself and can be named and addressed, but the slow, quiet damage of a man who is physically there and spiritually somewhere else. The damage of a child growing up learning that love and absence can occupy the same body simultaneously. He thought about Callum Voss on a concrete floor in Pelican Bay, shaking through withdrawal, looking at a photograph of a lake in Northern California where a 7-year-old boy and his father were laughing with ice cream on their noses. He thought about what it costs a person to carry that image through the worst thing that has ever happened to them, and what it means that they carry it at all. He thought about Rheta Voss holding out a bronze pin and a scratched Timex watch, the weight of 2 men's lives reduced to objects that fit in her palms, and saying the debt has been paid. He did not know if his debt was paid. He was not certain that debt was the right framework. Some things between fathers and sons were not debts to be settled, but distances to be closed, and the closing did not require that anyone had been right or wrong or adequately penitent. It required only that someone decide to move. He reached out, his hand large and heavily calloused and covered in the faded blue-gray of decades-old ink. The name Dale, visible in small letters on the inside of his left wrist, rested on the top of the stone. The marble was cold. He left it there. The desert sky above him had gone fully dark, and the stars were coming out over the inland valley in the quiet and different way they always come out, not asking to be noticed, not performing anything, simply present in the darkness, the way they had been present before anyone arrived to look at them and would be present long after. Enough of them to see by, enough to know that the darkness had edges and the light beyond those edges had been there all along, constant and unhurried, waiting for no one in particular. He stood at his father's grave in the cold November dark with his hand on the stone and his eyes open. When he was ready, he drove home. On the 215 North, both hands on the wheel, the heater running and the radio still off. Somewhere past Colton, he rolled the window down an inch and let the desert air in, cold and clean, and smelling of nothing in particular, the honest smell of empty space. He did not decide to do it. His hands simply moved, and the window opened, and the air came in, and he drove north through the dark with it against his face. He did not know what had shifted at the grave. He was not certain something had shifted at all in any way that would be visible tomorrow, or next week, or next year. The stone in his chest that had been there since the VA hospital called him 3 days too late was still there. It would probably always be there. But it felt in some way he could not precisely name, slightly less like a stone he was carrying, and slightly more like a stone he was walking away from. The difference was small. The difference was everything. The lights of Barstow came into view over the dark rise of the desert, scattered in orange and ordinary. The lights of a town that had never been a place people chose but had turned out for some of them to be exactly the place they needed. Hank Decker drove toward them with both hands on the wheel and the cold desert air coming through the window and the long days settling into him, the way long days settle, not with resolution exactly, but with the specific quiet of something that has been faced and survived and that will look different in the morning and different again the morning after that for as long as mornings keep coming.